Hi guys, it's Adoption Awareness Week. Thank you very much for your timely introduction. And we have our board here from Adopt Change, and we've been out there speaking all week and getting the word out there, and I've been saying for years, please academics help us. We don't have the answers, but we know there's a problem, and we've reached out to Jeremy in the past, so I thank you. And obviously you guys are going to learn a lot more tonight, but I just want to commend Jeremy. I say in the top of the book, I applaud everyone and anyone who joins in and puts up their hands to say we need to do this better. And we are out there all this week saying we do have to do this better. We are trying to offer solutions. We're working with the politicians, thrilled that Malcolm Turnbull and the new government is on board. So we are out there saying we need the community to be aware of the issue and to join us in reaching out to our leaders and policymakers to say, step up and change it. Our research shows 89% of people out there believe in adoption and know that it can work. So I'm going to hand it over to you guys to have the debate, and thank you, Jeremy, for putting this book out there. Happy Adoption Awareness Week. Thanks.
Well, thanks to Deborra-lee and the rest of the board of Adopt Change for coming along. Deborra-lee's made a huge difference in this issue by just bringing her sparkle and her celebrity and her charm and her beauty. And she's somebody who any media person will want to interview, and then she slams them over the head with a really serious issue. She doesn't want to talk about her husband or, Wolfman or whatever. She will talk about adoption underwater anytime, and she's made a huge difference. And the other person who I think has made an enormous difference and will make an enormous difference is Jeremy. He's a quietly spoken sort of intellectual researcher, but he has taken up this cause, which is really it's a difficult one, and I know he's been abused. I've had a little taste of that kind of vitriol and negativity when... sorry, too loud? No. When I've written columns about why adoption has become so taboo and why the negativity about adoption. And I think my interest in it started about 20 years ago when I was a police reporter and mostly doing my work in Western Sydney, because that's where most of the crime was. And child abuse and neglect was our bread and butter. So many of these dysfunctional families where they weren't, you couldn't even call them families, where terrible abuse and neglect, murders and so on were going on. And it was obvious that there was some sort of terrible welfare disease that was causing these children to be brought up with mothers particularly who were so drug addicted or unwell or had themselves been so badly abused that they'd lost that motherly instinct. And Noel Pearson talks about this too, that the evils of drugs and pornography and gambling and alcohol destroy the most important love that we have, which is the love of a mother for her child. And in those days, out in Mount Druitt and places like that where I was plying my trade as a police reporter, it seemed to me the only moral actors were the police, because they could see clearly what was wrong with these dysfunctional families. And yet social workers the police would take the children away and the social workers would put them back in. And I never really understood why until I read Jeremy's book, and it's a deep ideological condition, and it starts in the social work. He traces this very well in the social work faculties of universities. It has its roots in the 1960s in sort of feminist antagonism to the patriarchy and to the nuclear family. He explains that all very well. There's a perfect storm in Australia. That you have that ideological underpinning, and then at the same time you have the fuss that was made over both the stolen children apology and then later the forced adoption apology. And it's not to say that those women who had their children taken away from them and those children who were taken away, whether they were Indigenous or just the unmarried mothers of the 60s and the 70s. Of course they suffered, but that doesn't mean that adoption should just be thrown out. Just because, as Jeremy says, just because there are some natural parents and nuclear families that are dysfunctional and terrible does not mean that you should stop everyone from having children. So while no parent should be written off completely, neither should adoption. And unfortunately, because of this sort of perfect storm and the great two prime ministers elevating these apologies to these national shameful, events in our history, being Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard, we have adoption has become such a taboo subject that now Australia has a peculiarly low adoption rate. And Jeremy explains this. For instance, last year there were only 203 local adoptions, and that's compared with 50,000 in the US. So, we should be many more times greater. And even if we just got up to the same adoption rate of the US, we'd be doing better. Now, Jeremy also points out that, as in with a lot of social problems, money doesn't fix it. We've tripled the amount of money spent on child protection in the last 15 years, and children are worse off than ever. Now, Jeremy has solutions. He does very well. He identifies the problems. He explains how dreadful they are. He talks about some of these dysfunctional families that most Australians just can't even comprehend how chaotic and disastrous they are. But he also has solutions. So I'll let him explain better what they are. But because he's so knowledgeable about this, and because he has put the moral case for adoption so well, he's a wake-up to politicians' sort of sneaky ways that they will, they'll get up, they'll use the adoption bandwagon and Deborra-lee, Furness and her celebrity, and an issue that everybody, is on board with, I guess, if they're explained, if it's explained, and it seems like a noble cause, and then the bureaucracy just gets the better of them and nothing really changes. So what Jeremy's, the part of the value of his book is that he knows exactly what the obstructive ways that the bureaucracy stops people from changing the adoption laws. And there are a couple of heroes in the book. One of them is the former New South Wales Social Services Minister, Prue Goward, who managed, when Barry O'Farrell was Premier, managed to actually change adoption practices and change the law so that children were removed from very dangerous situations much earlier. And that became a model, and Christian Porter just last week said that New South Wales was a model that other states could follow. And as Deborra-lee said, Malcolm Turnbull, like Tony Abbott, has shown some interest in this issue. But again, Jeremy has a lot of advice about what not to do and what to do. And he, one of his solutions is that to dramatically increase adoptions, you have national annual adoption targets and an incentive payment scheme that rewards states that increase the number of adoptions. That's one of his plans. They're all brilliant, and I commend you, Jeremy, and your courage and your scholarship. And it's not a sexy topic, but it's a very important one. And if we're going to break the cycle of generational welfare, disadvantage and child abuse and neglect, and allow every child in Australia, no matter where they're born, to be able to reach their potential, the only way to do so is to intervene in these situations before their developing brains are permanently affected and they're never really able to live as full members of the Australian society. So without further ado, I launch officially Jeremy's book, and please...
Thank you, Miranda, for those very kind words and the endorsement of the book, and thank you to Deborra-lee for coming tonight and for writing the foreword to the book as well, and for her remarks tonight. As Peter said, the idea of tonight is not to just do a traditional book launch, but to try and prompt a discussion with people who support adoption, recognise the need for it, and are willing to speak out about a topic that it has become taboo. To start it off, I would just like to make a few comments about the book. I'm lucky that I think the thesis of the book is captured by both the title and the blurb on the back, which is that I think the child protection system in Australia is mad because we keep doing the same things that fail. We keep applying the same flawed strategies that basically mean that children are harmed by the system that's meant to protect them, because we put an overemphasis on family preservation, which prolongs the time that children are kept with highly dysfunctional families. And then when we finally remove them as a last resort, we then churn them through very unstable foster care and then return them to their families where the reunifications are likely to break down. Now that process can basically consume the whole of children's childhoods, and what it means for many children is that they spend almost all of their childhoods and adolescences in care, and they never get a permanent and safe family for life. Now, I think many of these children could have and should have been removed earlier before they were harmed, and many of them could have and should have been adopted. But they're not adopted because adoption is very, very, very rare in Australia, and those figures that Peter quoted tell us the story. 89 adoptions from care across the country, 84 of those in New South Wales alone, despite the fact there are over 43,000 children in care, 30,000 of them who've been in care for 2 years or longer, which is a proxy figure for the number of children who you might think could, at least in theory, be available for adoption. As well as describing how the current system fails, what the book has also tried to do is try to explain the obstacles to changing the system, despite what I think is the overwhelming evidence of the fact that it's a failed system. Now, these obstacles centre on the taboo on adoption. The taboo is basically the belief that adoption in contemporary Australia is a socially unacceptable and illegitimate practice, and that belief is largely based on the legacy of past practices. Having had the chance to reflect on the book, I just want to make a couple of further points about what the taboo means in practice and how we might need to go about breaking it. The cover of the book, as I'm sure you've noticed, features Gin Lane by William Hogarth. The use of this iconic image of parental dysfunction and child maltreatment was chosen with due consideration and aware of the potential controversies that I was courting. Gin Lane is one of the landmarks of 18th century British art, but it's also a piece of social commentary that was pivotal to the formation of the modern social conscience. And it also helped spur the development of the great movements for social improvement that took shape in Britain in the 19th century. One of those was the movement, what was then known as the anti-child cruelty movement, or the child rescue movement, which also spread to Australia around the same time. Now, this movement and the child welfare legislation that it spawned developed under the influence of no less a figure than John Stuart Mill. As I explain in the book, Mill was the first thinker to identify that children had independent rights as future citizens, and who argued that if parents failed to fulfil those fundamental obligations to the welfare and development of their children, then the state or its agent should step in to make sure that those obligations were fulfilled. Now, I believe that the ideology of family preservation, which currently prevails in the Australian child protection system, with its overemphasis on upholding the parental rights of abusive and neglectful parents, is a perversion of the true origins of the field of child protection in Mill's sense of children's rights and child rescue. Critics, or rather the defenders of the current approach, are likely to point to the cover and take offence at the apparent suggestion that what we're doing today in the name of child protection amounts to a return to Hogarthian times of society permitting and tolerating child abuse and neglect. I'm comfortable with that suggestion because that's precisely what I'm suggesting. If the claim that the current system presides over maltreatment instead of eradicating it, if that makes people uncomfortable, then good. because the weight of facts, logic and evidence that I compile in the book supports that claim. I'd also say that those who are shocked by the use of that image should consider my potential alternatives. One that I toyed with using was the photos that showed the utter chaos and filth in the dysfunctional household in which Chloe Valentine in South Australia was left to live and die by Families SA, which were entered into evidence during the coronial inquest that was conducted last year. Now, these images were simply too shocking and too disgusting, to be honest, to place on the cover. So I'd also suggest that those who find Hogarth shocking might also need to take their social consciences for a walk through the underclass homes in which many children suffer. And that's really the context in which I call for greater use of adoption. There is a major social problem. There is a growing underclass. There is a major problem with child welfare. And that's the basis of my conviction that there won't be any meaningful change and no end to the cycle of intergenerational dysfunction that Miranda talked about until the taboo on adoption is broken. I'm 100% certain of that. Now, the major barrier to breaking the taboo is what can be seen as a worthy sentiment, and in part is a worthy sentiment, which is the desire not to repeat past mistakes. Now, there's no suggestion anywhere in the book of denying that adoption was done badly in the past, when adoptions were closed, children were treated as blank slates, and no contact with families or knowledge of heritages was allowed. There's also no denying the malpractices associated with forced adoptions and the stolen generations. We also know that past practices did harm because there are children and families who can tell us these stories, and there may well be some of those people in this room. If so, you're welcome. Your stories are important and they need to be heard, because these stories are at the heart of modern open adoption practices, which are designed to ensure that adopted children don't struggle with their identity and they don't grow up as mysteries unto themselves. Yet if we're going to break the taboo, both sides of the debate need to speak openly about the issue, because taboos can't be broken unless you're prepared to say things that otherwise can't be said. And this requires acknowledging that individual stories of harm, without in any way diminishing those harms, are not the full story about adoption today. The negative stories based on the practices of earlier times need to be balanced with the many positive stories of successful adoptions that have occurred both in the past and in the present day. Now, what the opponents of adoptions maintain is that because some adoptions have been unsuccessful, there must be no adoptions. The notion that all adoptions are intrinsically harmful is the very definition of a taboo. But as may have been mentioned, I think, but the way that a taboo condemns all adoptions as an illegitimate way to form a family is an impossible test. And I think, as Peter said, imagine if we applied that to natural families. We said all families must be successful. If we applied that test, we would never allow anyone to have children. What I think also needs to be better understood is what the consequences are of taking a risk-averse attitude towards adoption. Because what in practice the taboo means is taking a risk-blind attitude towards the protection of children. It means ignoring the harm that the current system's doing to many children, and it also means ignoring the good that adoption could do for many of those children who are caught up in the current system. What I therefore hope for the book, if it does have an influence, is that it will encourage people to realise that what the terrible impact of any adoption attitudes on the operation of the child protection system are, what the impacts are on child wellbeing and on society as a whole. And so I hope it makes people rethink the idea that sentiments behind the adoption taboo are inherently worthy, because maybe the apparent desire not to repeat past mistakes is not as worthy as it seems. Finally, if the adoption taboo isn't broken, it's going to continue to cripple our ability to address the major social and child welfare problems that we face today. I hope you enjoy the book as best as you can. Thank you again for coming, and we're happy to take any questions that you have. Thank you.